Hello again. During this series, we've been exploring how the practice of worshipping Jesus by communing with fellow Christians in using bread and wine has traced back to the very earliest beginnings of Christian belief, and it continues to define Christians today. So we want to conclude this series by providing guidelines for those who've been given the responsibility of leading communion. And even if this isn't a part of your calling at the moment, I'm sure that what we're going to talk about will help us all to have a deeper appreciation of the significance of a group of believers worshipping in this way. So, communion leaders. I remember when we used to call them presidents and they used to preside over the communion table. But let's call you communion leaders today. It's really important, firstly, to prepare yourself. It's like we need to enter into communion before we lead others to communion. I was once taught that it's important to focus in 5 different directions before we lead communion. And the first is to look back. Look back at what Christ did nearly 2,000 years ago, in being sacrificed, in dying, in being crucified for you and me to save us from our sins. But also we need to look back at where we were, at where I was before I was saved. There's a verse in Romans 5:8 that combines those two looking back thoughts, and it says, Christ showed his love for us in that while we were yet sinners, he died for us. And that's a beautiful thought and a looking back thought. Then we need to look within. 1 Corinthians 11:28, I think, says, a man ought to examine himself before he eats of the bread and drinks of the cup. So looking within is examining myself, is to ask, what's the condition of my heart? Is Jesus the center of my life and my faith and my hope? I need to acknowledge my shortcomings, my sins, and humbly ask for forgiveness. And in some Christian traditions, that's known as a time of confession. And that's usually during the service, but I like to do it before I actually come to communion. And then as a communion leader, I need to look around. Before you actually go to communion, think of the people that you'll be leading and observing communion. Think of your church family. And they're the ones you'll not only be leading, but you'll also be communing with, sharing with them. Be aware that we are all one body and we're called to participate in this special observance together. So as the emblems are distributed, you're specially privileged. You're standing in front of the congregation and you'll have a chance to look around and you can see the feelings expressed on the congregation in front of you. And you can also notice those who are missing. And so there's this sort of pastoral element to your role. But that pastoral element doesn't finish when you get down from the platform. Find a way afterwards to speak to those that you've specifically noticed who were having some sort of spiritual, emotional crisis or particularly moved during communion. Or contact those who weren't there and pray for those that God has brought to your mind while you're in the process of looking around. And then I've been advised to look ahead to the future. During communion, we look ahead to the day of the great wedding supper of the Lamb. That's a phrase that comes from Revelation 19, right at the end of the Bible and at the end of this current age. We're told by Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 that the ceremony that you're going to lead proclaims the Lord's death until he comes. So we are looking forward to the future as well. Remind yourself that this observance isn't only about the here and now. It's got eternal significance. And then we're told to look up. The observance of communion encourages us, urges us to lift up our hearts. It's an opportunity to fix our eyes and our hearts and our minds afresh on Jesus lifted high on the cross as he was crucified, but now seated on high, enthroned in glory at the right hand of the Father. So they're wonderful things to look up to. So before you lead communion, lift up your heart, lift up your life to God, and lift up the congregation that you're going to lead at this time as well.